here. It's a huge pleasure to introduce Professor Ros Ballaster. And Ros is going to speak about what is in a context. And Ros is professor of 18th century studies in the Faculty of English, teaches at Mansfield College here. Her most recent book is Fictions of Presence, Theater and Novel in 18th Century Britain from 2020. And quite intriguingly, I'd love to know more about this. Ros has forthcoming in September 2025, Jane Austen's Fashion Bible. So one to be sure to go out and get. Thanks, Ros. You go for it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kirsten. I'm going to try and share my screen. I hope everyone can see that.
Yep, that's great.
Just trying to, there we go, put it from the beginning of the slideshow. So there we go. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so context is one of the key concepts in AS and A-level specifications in English. The term derives from the Latin contextus, con, together, and texere, weave. So we might think of a context as sitting alongside a text, but also woven into a text. You might think of a text of any kind, literary or not, as something made up of lots of different threads. I think students, and sometimes we too, tend to think of context as sort of containers that sit outside of a text. And I want us rather to think about them as material that's constitutive of a text, woven into it, which is why I've put that little parenthesis there, what is in a context, so that you can see it sort of textually, sort of that in sitting there parenthetically within that question. Before I try and pull some threads together, let's just try and separate them out by thinking about the different kinds of context we consider significant to bring to analysis of a text. So here's our text. Most students will probably reach first to the biography of an author to explain a work. Next, they might look to literary, cultural, or generic context. Is this a play or a novel or a poem? What are the features it's displaying that are particular to the culture, the literary norms, and the expectations of genre we might know about? And this might lead us on to thinking about political or social context. What could be said or known or done in the moment of the text production. And I'm going to think a bit more about each in turn. I should remind you that I'm going to go on to talk about the poetry of abolition. So there will be information about slavery and the lives and experiences of enslaved people in the 18th century in Britain and America in this talk. But I'm going to talk a bit more about each of those contexts first. Biography. Knowing something about the author and the author's other works is probably the first context we seek out if there's a name attached to a work. When asked to explain why they're reading a particular work, readers often respond that they read something they read something else by the author and they liked it. But we also know that the author's a relatively recent product of Western culture. Indeed, some might argue an invention of the late 18th century of Romanticism itself. Wordsworth writes a prelude in 1804, a poem on my earlier life or the growth of a poet's mind, he says. He's doing something very bold, saying his own poet's mind is a worthy subject for an epic. And we might contrast this with his major source, Milton's Paradise Lost of 1667, which promises rather to justify the ways of God to man. So the poet for Wordsworth is no longer the servant of God, but has a responsibility to explain his own subjectivity. The author, rather than God, has become the centre of the literary text. But we've also come to see the author as a product of the text rather than someone who precedes it. So this is Michel Foucault in his influential essay, What is an Author? These aspects of an individual which he designates as making him an author are only a projection, in more or less psychologizing terms, of the operations that we force text to undergo, the connections that we make, the traits that we establish as pertinent, the continuities that we recognize, or the exclusions that we practice. As an example, I think about the author known as George Eliot. Several popular and influential 19th century novels were written by a woman named Marian Evans, but we refer to them as the works of George Eliot, the name she published under. If I write, for instance, that George Eliot approved of independence in women, the evidence for this is taken from her novels, rather than being something I know about Marian Evans herself. There is evidence in her life of this. She lived outside of wedlock with George Henry Lewis and supported herself by her writing. But my statement is about the authorial function produced by the fiction, not about the attitudes of a particular 19th century woman. Let's move on to think about political or social context. Texts also, of course, reflect their own moment of production, and these contexts can illuminate our understanding. Marxist critics have been influential in pointing to the importance of political and social context in determining what texts mean. They see literary texts as both contributing to and criticising the ideologies of their historical moment. For my example, let's look at Robinson Crusoe, published in 1719. We can read it as a celebration of the emergent ideology of bourgeois individualism, the capacity of a middle-class man to forge his own destiny through material progress and to enjoy his own independent and unmediated relationship to God and power. The island, then, is just a device to put him alone and show his resourcefulness. Crusoe not only survives when shipwrecked, but he profits, developing his own estate, acquiring livestock, and eventually his own servant in the shape of the man he names Friday. However, this celebration of an independent spirit is also undercut by the representation of Crusoe as a relatively nervous and neurotic figure, fearful of the threat other beings pose to his authority on his island, and unable to relate to anything but material goods. So the book might also be a critique of that ideology. So, our final context, literary, cultural, and generic. Purists and aesthetes might argue that the only relevant context for a literary work is another literary one. The school of criticism that emerged in early and mid-20th century America of new criticism argues that the only thing you need to understand a text is on the page already. One context that is perhaps more woven into a text and more important to even our activities of close reading, though, is that of genre, the type or genus or species of a work. And identifying formal features in a work often points us to genre. So let's offer a formal context to turn to the debate about the poetry of abolition that I've promised will be the focus of my discussion. So let's look at these two verses from a poem of 1788. Forced from home and all its pleasures, Afric's coast I left forlorn, to increase the stranger's treasures o'er the raging billows borne. Men from England bought and sold me, paid my price in paltry gold, but though slave they have enrolled me, mines are never to be sold. Deem our nation brutes no longer, till some reason ye shall find worthier of regard and stronger than the colour of our kind. Slaves of gold, whose sordid dealings tarnish all your boasted powers, prove that you have human feelings, ere ye proudly question ours. So if we just, this is a poem from 1788, let's just think about its formal context. What kind of poem is this? Each stanza is made up of 8 lines, 2 quatrains of alternate rhyme. The lines alternate between 8 and 7 syllables. It was written, in fact, to be sung to the tune of a popular ballad, Admiral Hosier's Ghost. It's a lyric poem written in the voice of an African slave, asserting his freedom and calling out those who operate the slave trade and exploit the labour of enslaved people. It turns an age-old tradition of complaint poetry dating back to Ovid into a form for modern times. If we brought biographical context to this poem, though, it might alter our view a little. This poem is by a white Englishman who never travelled to the Caribbean or the Americas, nor left his native soil, William Cooper. He also wrote a number of anti-slavery poems encouraged by his friend and reformed slave trader John Newton, the curate at Olney, where Cooper lived most of his adult life. This and other works were commissioned to promote the cause of abolition. Let's look at a different poem. And I'll read this out quickly too. To show the labouring bosom's deep intent and thought in living characters to paint, when first thy pencil did those beauties give, and breathing figures learnt from thee to live, how did these prospects give my soul delight, a new creation rushing on my sight? Still, wondrous youth, each noble path pursue, on deathless glories fix thine ardent view. Still may the painter's and the poet's fire to aid thy pencil and thy verse conspire. Still with the sweets of contemplation blessed, may peace with balmy wings your soul invent. Sorry, I can't actually see this because I'm obscured from seeing it. Here we go. Try here. Invest. But when these shades of time are chased away, and darkness ends in everlasting day, on what seraphic pinions shall we move, and view the landscapes in the realms above? There shall thy tongue in heavenly murmurs flow, and there my muse with heavenly transport glow. No more to tell of Damon's tender sighs, or rising radiance of Aurora's eyes, for nobler themes demand a nobler strain, and purer language on the ethereal plain. Cease, gentle muse, the solemn gloom of night now seals the fair creation from my sight. So this is a poem written in rhyming couplets of iambic pentameter. It's a fairly simple form. It seems a fairly conventional poem written by a poet to a painter, in which the poet compares their respective arts and encourages the painter to continue his art in order to inspire the poet to seek to achieve similar lifelikeness and sublime energy. So it's a work of ekphrasis, the description of a work of visual art in a verbal one. And it's a fairly conventional devotional poem about the sublime affordances both poet and painter will find in heaven to extend their art. But again, biographical context brings a slightly different angle. This is a poem entitled To S.M., a young African painter, on seeing his works, and it's by Phillis Wheatley Peters. Phillis Wheatley was the first published African-born female poet in the English-speaking world. Born in West Africa, probably the Gambia, she was sold into slavery at the age of 7 or 8 and transported to North America. The Wheatley family of Boston, her enslavers, taught her to read and write and encouraged her poetry when they saw her talent. Her name, rather than being a gesture to the pastoral, comes from the ship that brought her to Boston, the Phyllis, and her surname from the family that bought her. Her poems on various subjects, religious and moral, were published on September the 1st, 1773, under the patronage of Selina Hastings, Countess of Huntingdon, a Methodist abolitionist. During Wheatley's visit to England, African-American poet Jupiter Hammond praised her work in another poem of his own. So we're already seeing two contexts of reading, a circle of white abolitionists promoting her work in Selina Hastings, and a circle of other black artists entering into conversation with her and others. Wheatley was released from enslavement shortly after the publication of her book. She married another freed slave, John Peters, in 1778. Two of her children died as infants. After her husband was imprisoned for debt in 1784, Wheatley fell into poverty and died of illness. Back to the poem then, and our reading of it in context. It's praising the art of Scipio Moorhead, another enslaved person, both an artist and a poet. It was probably Scipio who drew Phyllis's portrait, which appeared in the front, as the frontispiece in her book of poems that you can see here. As a fellow artist, she's striving to comprehend the creative processes that achieve his purpose and also gives her, as the audience of his work, such pleasure. She encourages Moorhead to make the most of his gifts and to enjoy any fame that comes to him. But at the same time, she fixes their thoughts on the afterlife, a particularly rich, sort of visionary place for enslaved people, of course. A recent biography, and a very fine one about Phyllis Wheatley by historian David Waldstreich, has proved that a really important context for her poetry was her reading in classical literature, especially Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, in which wind and sail-born heroes travel between Africa and the Mediterranean. She transforms classical pagan narrative into stories of Christian imagining, the religion to which she was introduced when she was trafficked to America. And I've given you that quote at the bottom, and I'll just conclude this section by his wonderful comment. She aimed for the universal without forgetting who was suffering most and why, a message surely for our times as well as for her times. So, thinking about biographical context might require us to adjust our thinking. A poem in the voice of an African enslaved person is in fact authored by a white Englishman who never visited the colonies where that labour was exploited. A poem that looks like a conventional piece of ekphrastic reflection on artistic labour is written by one enslaved person, a female child with precocious talent, to another enslaved person, a young male African with precocious talent. Knowing these contexts invites us to think differently about both poems, what their language of blackness and whiteness, labour and leisure, justice and injustice, punishment and salvation might point to and require us to reflect on. I'm just going to talk briefly about the wider political and social context here. I don't know if any of you've ever seen this wonderful visualization, which I'm just going to move it on so we look a little later. This shows you the slave ships traveling, European ships transporting an estimated 12.5 million enslaved people to European colonies in America and the Caribbean from the 16th century to 1860. And at least 2 million people died during this voyage of the Middle Passage. Okay, I'm going to move my PowerPoint on if I can. What's happening here? Maybe I need to stop this. Let's try that. Oop. There we go. By the 1780s, the British movement for abolition had grown into one of the first large-scale grassroots activist campaigns. They weren't, of course, calling for an end to slavery as an institution, but for the trade in slaves. And you can see then that the aims of the campaign were limited, and so was its power. Most of its supporters didn't even have the right to vote. They could write letters and sign petitions, but their greatest influence was as consumers, boycotting sugar made by slaves, and they could show their sympathies by buying and displaying abolitionist merchandise, such as what you're seeing here, all derived from that famous image of a chained African man with the slogan, am I not a man and a brother, from the pottery factory of Josiah Wedgwood. So we might think of this as another cultural and artistic way of speaking to a public audience, not unlike that used by both Cooper and Wheatley. The aim is to build community, to speak to fellow enslaved persons and to those who might work together for abolition and emancipation. Okay. Now, the voices of African enslaved persons are hard to find and to hear. And we're only likely to find those writers like Wheatley who are educated and far from representation of the majority of enslaved persons. Saidiya Hartman, American historian, has argued for the need for critical fabulation as a strategy to imagine those lives and persons that have been lost to us and purposely suppressed. So she argues for a style of creative semi-non-fiction that attempts to bring the suppressed voices of the past to the surface by means of hard research and scattered facts. And another and last context I want to mention that might sit alongside the slight materials we do have are those voices now that are entering into conversation with the lost figures of the past. One such work is a book of poems by Honoré Fannin Jeffers, Black American writer, published in 2021 called The Age of Phyllis. Jeffers spent 15 years researching Phyllis Peters and her contexts. The poems tell of her relationship and friendship, Phyllis's, with Oba Tanner, another enslaved person, and they imagine her marriage to Peters and her motherhood and the age she lived in. So these contexts of culture and genre are not unrelated to the political and social context, nor to the biographical ones. And you might want to encourage your students to reflect on which context they find most significant when they explore and research the literature you introduce them to. I think perhaps the most important and elusive context, and one I've not explored so much in this lecture, is that of the reader's own hunger and curiosity about literature. And in that context, I'm going to give you a last slide with some suggested critical reading to pursue if you want to look further into the topic I've been talking about. Thank you.